this webinar on ensuring the climate has a future after the corona crisis. We're delighted to say we have 3 guest speakers tonight. We have Alice Picard from ATTAC France, who's going to speak first, and then Nnimmo Bassey from Nigeria, followed by Danny Paffard, who is from the Green New Deal UK organisation. I'm going to ask each speaker to speak for about 8 to 10 minutes or so, and after which we'll have time for questions and discussion with the panelist. Now, if you're new to being on a webinar on Zoom, at the bottom, in the middle of your screen, you should have a Q&A icon. If you want to ask a question of the speakers, please do so using Q&A. You also have chat, and we're encouraging people to use chat to say who you are, where you're from, where you're tuning in from, just so we got a better idea of the people who are participating tonight. That would be great. And if people want to have chats with individuals, that's absolutely fine. Hello to John Oversby for reporting in on the chat. That's great to see you, John. So we're going to, I can see that the numbers of people tuning in are still clicking up at quite a rate. So what we're going to do is probably I will waffle on for another couple of minutes, and then we'll start with Alice. This is actually the last in our series of webinars on the corona crisis. We started, I think, way back at the end of April. We've been holding these webinars about once a fortnight, and they've been tremendously successful, and been really pleased to see so many people tuning in. And it's not the end of our online outputs. We have a number of different initiatives coming up, but also, but one of the key things is going to be on Saturday, 27th of June. There'll be an activists assembly on the theme of the UK-US trade deal. There's more information about that on the Global Justice Now site. So I think we're going to start. We're up to 126 people participating. That's great, and I'm sure that will grow over the next 130. Sorry, so it's still going on. So anyway, we're going to start now with Alice Picard from ATTAC France, who's going to outline what ATTAC France is doing in this situation. So Alice, go ahead.
Well, thank you very much, and first, thank you for inviting me. So I'm gonna keep an eye on the time because I'm sure that what I prepared is too long. And first of all, English is not my first language, so please excuse any grammar or pronunciation mistake that I could make. So this campaign, Ecological and Social Revolution, is our latest campaign, but I think that what I want to say tonight is that it wouldn't exist if there hadn't been preliminary steps and conditions such as former campaigns, past campaigns, and dialogues with a broad range of organizations. And in a way, it's just a new branding for a very old idea that we are promoting in ATTAC France. And it's just that the branding compels us to think more thoroughly about the articulation between ecological and the social dimensions of the revolution that we are calling for. Up until now, it's true that we were more talking about social and climate justice, which indeed is a little bit more narrow approach. So I think that I'm going to focus more on the process rather than the content. And as I was preparing for this webinar, I was desperately trying to sum up briefly what we mean by an ecological and social revolution, and I think that I failed. And then yesterday we had a welcome meeting for new members in my region, and someone stressed that what is good with ATTAC is that our thinking is always evolving, and that it's something that the person appreciated about us. And I think our ecological and social revolution campaign is just the result of our constant evolving thinking. So I'm going to focus then on the steps that led to this campaign, and just to stress that it's not that the process is more important than the content, but I think the process determined the content of the campaign that we are actually building just now. So I think that it's always been in the DNA of ATTAC to say that the responsibility for the social and the ecological crisis are not shared equally between North and South countries first, but even within Western countries, the responsibility is not the same between the people who, you know, have the wealth and the poor people. So there's nothing new in this campaign, but we want to underline again that it's all about money and the power to allocate it. And so we started. So I'm going to try and share my screen now. No, I can't. But well, it's okay. I just it was just to illustrate. It was just a few pictures. Nothing really important. But we started in 2018 with our Not With Our Money campaign, and it was basically to ask for a disinvestment from fossil fuels, and we were targeting banks, and especially a kind of public bank. It's not exactly a bank, but it's an institution that manages savings, and we were asking for this institution to stop funding fossil fuels. So that was the first step, and then and before that we had a campaign entitled 1 Million Climate Jobs. It was in 2017, and actually it was an idea coming from the UK, and we published a report outlining where the jobs could be created, with what money in public as well as in private sectors. And then, so there was the Yellow Vest movement last year. Well, it's still ongoing, but mainly it was last year. And we had a campaign saying that end of the month and end of the world were actually the same struggles, and it was intended to echo the demands that the Yellow Vests had during the winter last year. And then more recently, we started a dialogue with around 20 organizations, and that's quite a new development, because in this new group, you have trade unions as well as environmental groups, and I think it's quite new. Usually these two kinds of organizations don't really talk to each other, and as ATTAC itself is an organization that consists in, you know, who have has founding members. They usually come to us when we are trying to make conversions happen, and so we started a dialogue, and then I think the lockdown and the crisis sped up the process a little bit, and we published a report 2 or 3 weeks ago. It's Plus Jamais Ça, so it means never again, and we have written 34 demands for a recovery plan or an exit plan from the crisis. And so it's really good that all these organizations could participate. So as well, trade unions as well as environmental organizations. And so that's why I said that the process was important as well, because then these organizations have to work together, listen to what they each have to say, which is really good. But anyway, we're trying to articulate the ecological and social dimensions. So we are, and by social, I think it's not only the class aspect. I think that we are actually focusing also on gender and race. So it's ecological and social dimensions in that sense. And what we are asking for is a clear shift in the economy. That means a clear that we are saying it's a clear democratic issue. It's quite old, but sometimes it's good to bring this up again. So it goes a bit further than just demanding a halt, which is important, a halt to trade deals, or privileging public investment over private allocation of money. But we are saying that communities must regain control over what is produced, how, and with what purpose. So we want to do away with the profit-driven economy, basically. Okay, I think that I've got to be a little bit quicker. So we published this recovery plan, and also more recently a book on relocalizations, that we want relocalization to be solidarity based. So it means that we want to make clear that we don't want to close borders or be selfish in a kind of way. We want to think about this relocalization process, as well as making sure that it's in solidarity with the global South, and that we can keep exchange, collaborate, and support their development. And I think I'm going to say a few words about the stakes and the challenges. And there are challenges when you are carrying out a campaign with trade unions and environmental organizations. You have to be clear on a few things, and sometimes, so it's going to make trade unions happy. And we have published recently a brief note on the money that is going to be given to Renault, so a car industry company. And clearly, we are trying to say nicely that we don't agree with the main trade union in the sector, because they just want relocalization of the production and to shift from fossil fuel cars to electrical cars. And we say that it's not going to be enough. We want to rethink modes of transport, and also the mobility and urban planning. And we don't think that electrical cars are a solution, but we are trying to be as constructive as we can, so as not to stop the dialogue with trade unions. So that's a challenge, but I think that we are doing pretty good so far. So I'm really glad to continue this discussion, and I'm looking forward to the other speakers' talk. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Alice. That's a really good start, and it's really good to hear that such positive action has been taken in France. We will move on to Nnimmo, who has a huge reputation and a huge track record in fighting for climate justice in Nigeria and internationally. I'm not going to steal his thunder by giving him an overlong introduction. I'll just let him take it from here. And Nnimmo, over to you.
Thank you so much, and thanks, Alice, for that presentation. Thanks, everyone who have joined this webinar. I will try to be quick. I just went to a link that was shared that says the world has 6 months to avert climate crisis, and that's really very, very alarming. I would have thought we had double that time, but 6 months really short. People thought that the coronavirus pandemic has more or less shown the world clearly that something needs to be done, that things can change, and that it's time to hold the brakes in terms of the release of greenhouse gases to the atmosphere, all the pollution, all the problems in the oil fields. But that doesn't seem to be the case. The lessons are all around us. The message is very clear, but the power of capital doesn't seem to allow the polluters to think of changing the model. They just want to move the system to get it creaking and moving on for as long as possible. I speak this from if you look around where the fossil fuels are being extracted, because I'm speaking from the position of the fact that the supply of fossil fuels will continue to propel global warming, and that we'll have to really get to the beginning of the pipeline to stop further extraction, further expansion of fossil fuel extraction, whether gas or oil or coal. So the pandemic so far has the oil prices went down, but the oil wells have never been shut down. It has stopped oil spills. Rivers, creeks, and lakes in places like Niger Delta, where I come from, is still being privatized and used by the oil corporations as their waste dumps. So there's no, and secondly, politicians in Africa especially believe that even though the price of even though the resources may not have as much value as they used to have, but there's a very low value placed on the quality of environment and the people. That means corporations can totally discount environmental costs and continue to reap profit even when the resource itself has very low value. And surprisingly, some of our leaders in Africa have said that, a quote once said, Africa would develop with oil and gas, whether the West likes it or not. That sounds like poetry, but it's not poetry, but it's a very horrible declaration, which more or less says that no matter how bad the climate situation is, no matter how dire the situation is, we are going to keep on burning fossil fuels. We're not going to move to alternative energy resources because this is what we've got, and we've got to get the money. Sometimes the arguments are very political and they make sense, especially when somebody wears the catch-up hat, want to catch up with somebody else, so somebody else use a certain means to get to where they are, so you want to use the same. But that argument doesn't just work, because you cannot replicate the system, the horrible systems that built the world, especially for the global north over the past centuries. And we've seen reports also done by researchers who have shown that rather than reduce production, polluting industries are continuing to spend a lot of money to deny global warming. And they're planning already to double fossil fuel production by 2030 by the amount of investment that is already on. Yeah, I read this morning that a massive $22 billion liquefied natural gas project in Mozambique, which has been driven by Total, they've just concluded the financial arrangement. And most of the money is being derived from speculations on the amount of reserve available. So it's not about selling the resource, it's about speculating about how much reserve you have that you could sell into the future. So the future is already seen as being built on the pathways of fossil fuel, continual dependence on fossil fuels, and that is really very sad. We look at the Paris Agreement targets of 2 degrees and 1.5 degrees, and for Africa, if you permit me, for Africa, if the current current fossil fuel reserves are exploited in full, we're still going to exceed the 2 degrees target. So if the known fossil fuels reserve and the ones that are just being found are the new exploration, the new oil fields being developed, new gas fields, new coal mines are being developed, then we're going to overshoot the targets very, very much. Now, how come nations are not really willing to pay the price, to value the planet and the people more than capital? It's because for a long time, many countries have depended on natural resources for their budget, and especially the fossil fuel exporting countries like Nigeria, Venezuela, Saudi Arabia, Angola, Ecuador, Libya, Gabon, Algeria, Kuwait, and the rest. It depends so much on the value of a price of a barrel of crude oil to balance their budget, and most of them require that the price should be hovering around $50, $60, $70 per barrel. But that is not the case right now. So many of these countries are having serious crisis in terms of how to balance their budget. So when it comes to global warming, you find that people are willing to hang their ideas on false solutions, the ideas that things can be done. You can keep on with the current pathways, then find some other ways to counteract, to build a net zero economy, a net zero carbon economy, where you keep on polluting, then you find a way of capturing some of that. And this will lead to more land grabs, sea grab through the blue economy, through geoengineering, ocean fertilization, and sky grab, of course, through various means of weather modification, either the whitening of the clouds through the injection of sulfates into the stratosphere, or cloud brightening with seawater, or carbon capture and burial, or production of genetically modified trees that have higher levels of chlorophyll that can absorb more carbon. The ideas never end. It's a plethora of ideas. And all this is to ensure that we locking destructive development pathways and believe that technology will solve the problem. You keep hearing about this in the Conference of Parties, negotiations of climate change, that look, technology will solve the problem, this and that will solve the problem, rather than stopping the pollution at the problem at source, which is what we need to get done. But the arguments about have the polluters driving negotiations, influencing the rule books and all that. All these are about the power, the logic of power. That's one thing that we really need to look at. That is really ensuring that nothing real is being done. So we're still on the pathways for carbon colonization, carbon slavery. Carbon slavery has been illustrated by the RED project in Mozambique and other places. There was a particular case where a community was paid, families were paid less than $100 to protect certain trees for 90 years. And if those families, the leaders of the families died off, the children will carry on the burden of protecting the tree because of the carbon in the tree, not the value of the tree, not what the tree is, not what the forest is meant to be. People forget that a forest is not a carbon stock. A forest is a living ecosystem. A forest is where community and life exist, where there's interaction of so many life forms. So you have that going on. You still have big dams being proposed, like the Inga Tree Dam on the Congo River and big dams elsewhere. And some people have their frontier of saying that nuclear power is green. Can you imagine that? Now, coming to the COVID crisis. The coronavirus and false climate solutions are almost, they have a lot of similarities. The COVID-19 is very opportunistic because most people who succumb to it are people who had underlying health causes. Now the false solutions latch on the fact that, look, the stories that climate impacts can be offset by certain actions, while others keep polluting, others can keep doing the action, and they exchange money in between them. So COVID-19 intensifies existing vulnerabilities, and this is what global warming does when there's no climate action. The vulnerabilities are getting higher, people are less resilient to impact, nobody's paying for loss and damage, and we find that the COVID generated a lot of resources. I mean, not generated resources in that sense, but it provided the platform for corporations to be bailed out one more time. These same corporations would not do anything to bail out the poor, who keeps on being drowned by climate impacts. My organization wrote a book recently called "Who Benefits from Coronavirus?" Because we saw right from the beginning of the pandemic that there was a lot of economic interest in the future of the pandemic, about how to move about money in terms of debts being owed by some countries. So that rather than taking action, you just pretend that you are slowing down the repayment of the debt so that things can go on as usual. Everything is to continue with business as usual. So we must understand the logical power in terms of tackling global warming and tackling even the coronavirus. The basis of global warming, in some of our experiences, is environmental racism. Even as racism is very high on the agenda in the world today, it's just clearly neo-colonial, more inequalities, and it's just a kind of people being in denial of ongoing ecocide in many oil fields and coal fields and gas fields across the world, not just in Africa, also in Europe, in North America, in Canada, in Latin America, in Asia, everywhere. We're seeing a denial to recognize that it's a climate debt and ecological debt that needs to be paid. And so what do we need to do? The whole argument, the whole plans we must forge together is a radical socioeconomic transformation, which includes, of course, ecological aspects. And I'll just round up here by saying that we have to do all we can to reconnect to nature, across nature. This is what the lockdown has told us. And we've seen examples of nature recovering, but this may not happen once the lockdown is over. This may not continue. Then, of course, we have to build the future by reimagining our narrative. What kind of future do we want? What kind of life, what kind of economic system do we want to run? And how do we want to live together in the North, in the South, in the West, and in the East? Which means that there's need for political action. We go on the streets, make it real political action. We need to strengthen solidarity. We need to build more linkages between the regions. Recently, when the virus pandemic started, I wrote an article titled, "The virus will not change anything, we won't change." The virus will not change anything, we will not change. And I just want to quote that paragraph and I close with that. A key fact we have to face is that the coronavirus will not change anything, we won't change. The change that will frame the post-pandemic era will come from humans, our relationship with each other and with nature. The push for change will inevitably revolve around our interpretation of what is happening around us. So how do we interpret what is going around us? What is our imaginary? What is the future we're looking for? That is what will help us fashion what we must do, because the virus itself, no matter how deadly it is, will not change anything.
Thank you so much, Nnimmo. It was fantastic to hear your words there. Before I invite Danny to be the final speaker at this webinar, I just want to invite participants to field questions to our panelists. At the bottom of your screen, you'll see a Q&A icon. Please use that to ask questions. I've seen a few questions have appeared on the chat, which is fine, but I'm going to be concentrating on the Q&A. So if you've asked a question on chat, could you repeat it, please, in Q&A? So I have them all in front of me, and I'll put them to the panelists. If you haven't asked a question yet, please do. We will have probably about 50 minutes to grill our participants on their talks and their practice, really. We also are we are putting up links in the chat if to help explain or further illustrate what people are talking about if you want to find out more. So we'll also continue doing that. So please feel free to use the chat to chat to each other, or just to say who you are, where you're from, and why you're here. So I'm going to ask Danny to come in now, and Danny is from the Green New Deal UK organisation, which is quite a young organisation, and she's here to explain exactly what they need and what they want out of the corona crisis and what follows. So, Danny, you've got 10 minutes.
Great. Thank you so much for having me. It's a real pleasure to be on such a great panel, and yeah, I've been following kind of Nnimmo for years, and yeah, I was very impressed with ATTAC. I think when I arrived in Paris and they were stealing chairs from banks to like really make the point, and I was like, yes, these people, they're good. So it's a real pleasure to be here this evening. My name's Danny. I am an environmental and social justice campaigner. I'm currently head of organising at Green New Deal UK, but I used to work for 350, running the fossil fuel divestment campaign in the UK, and have been involved in lots of kind of social and environmental kind of direct actions over the years, kind of stopping tax avoidance or fossil fuel projects or various things. Yeah, was really excited to kind of spent a year in Nigeria to come back and to get involved with Green New Deal organising, which felt like, which at the time was kind of like excitement was kind of bubbling up around. And I guess what I'm going to speak to today very briefly is like introduce that idea and our like political analysis, and then talk about the Build Back Better campaign and like what we're doing and like how to get involved. And yeah, that's what I'll do. So yeah, we started with, you know, Green New Deal, which is this kind of big, it's not a single policy, it's a whole kind of transformation, it's a state of mind, it's a full kind of rip up and kind of 10-year mass mobilization of government resources to tackle this kind of major problem of like the double crisis of climate and inequality, and really recognizing that those two things are one and the same crisis, and we tackle them together. And we cannot do it unless we fundamentally transform our economy. And the time for tinkering around the edges is gone. We need a full-scale kind of transformative Green New Deal. So yeah, Green New Deal UK started in November, and see ourselves as the kind of an organising hub around the Green New Deal. And we work with, you know, the youth strikers and Labour for Green New Deal and 350 are all part of our kind of governance structure. And it's really about organising, because I think, you know, the Green New Deal was proposed by some left-wing academics after the financial crisis, and their analysis is you can have the best ideas in the world, but unless you're on the ground organising for them, fighting for them, pushing for them, it's not going to work. So kind of being in this space where we felt like, you know, everyone was talking about Green New Deal policies and like, what did the policy need to be? What do the demands need to be? And it's like, who's organising for this? How are we demanding this in our communities? So that's kind of where we started. Our like political analysis, you know, we launched, you know, a few weeks before the election was called, and obviously post-election a kind of transformative progressive Green New Deal is like a difficult thing to achieve with a very solid conservative majority who's not interested in those kind of very basically radical socialist transformations, even though we're not party aligned. And so we felt the key was like local organising and building power in our communities, and like working to build across like organised youth, organised workers and organised communities to build that power. And then came coronavirus, and we're like, okay, the time for like local small scale organising is not right now. This is a kind of key moment where like our whole world has been turned upside down, kind of really exposing the kind of horrible vulnerabilities across society that have been really kind of pulled out in this moment, and completely changed our like whole concept of like, you know, reminding us what is important, and you know, what government can do when it pulls its finger out and like, you know, actually gets to work putting kind of people's needs first, or what it could do. So we kind of sat down with a bunch of organizations and were like, how do we make sure that in this moment we take this kind of new reality and make sure that we build from this, and we don't go back to business as usual, and we do create something better. So we got together with a bunch of organizations, and we designed the Build Back Better campaign. Oh yeah, actually very good. Thank you. And we've got a kind of steering group that's made up of unions, of health organizations, of green groups, of young people, and frontline groups, including kind of migrant rights groups. And we worked, and there's now about 70 or 80 organizations signed up, and we worked on a series of kind of key demands that we wanted, the principles behind this recovery and what we wanted. And it was about protecting people, investing in our public services, and really committing to you know, transforming society with the Green New Deal to tackle the climate crisis. So that's where we got to. And then the kind of campaign, we have these principles, and we're working with the New Economics Foundation to like do a kind of collaborative process to turn them ultimately into policy demands. But I'm not a policy person, I'm an organizer. And, you know, best policies in the world, unless people are shouting for them, it doesn't matter. So this campaign is about like building the kind of public support, which turns into political pressure to make a kind of just and green recovery possible. So we recognise we're in this kind of two-phase recovery at the moment. So the government is like, you know, really rapidly responding and doing kind of firefighting emergency measures at the moment, and we'll move into a kind of recovery, more like longer term recovery stuff in what's looking like the autumn. And our strategy is really around like, number one, storytelling, and like lifting up the stories of those like charismatic frontline workers, the nurses, the shop stewards, the fruit pickers, who are now the kind of heroes, rightly so, of the economy, and telling their stories about what it means to build back better, to have good conditions, to be paid properly, to have bursaries, to have a funded public health system, and lift up their voices. There's a narrative, a storytelling piece around that, and we're inviting people to tell their stories. And there's a second element, which is around like mobilizing around key moments and kind of having our voices collectively heard. And there's also a key piece around local organizing, because we think that is really important. And I'll just kind of like finish off by explaining, because I think I've only got like 2 minutes left, by explaining the kind of local organizing element. So we think that we've just launched kind of on the website a kind of community sign-on pledge. And the idea is that people in their communities work together and reach out to the other organizations, you know, in their area, be their unions, be their youth groups, be their environmental groups, faith groups, and work together on an open letter to their MP to show the really broad-based support around key demands for building back better, because we ultimately believe that only with a really broad-based and diverse social movement will we have these asks heard. So we've launched that tool. We're asking people to self-organize, pick it up in their community. If you're the person that takes on the spreadsheet, you get added to the map, and then people come and find you. It's a bit bootleg, it's simple, but you know, that's what we need. And we'll be taking part in the Climate Coalition mass lobby on the 30th of June. So a chance to like for people to get in front of their MPs and talk about what they care about. And then we'll be building to a big hand in at some point over the summer when we've got enough kind of political power behind them. So that's, and we're doing local organizer trainings at the moment. If you want a briefing, it's all on the website on the Start Organizing tab. And the final thing that we are thinking about is mobilizations, and how do we like act in this moment with social distancing to like raise the profile of issues. And I think key things coming up. The first one is the NHS's birthday on the 5th of July. It's going to be 72. What a great moment to celebrate not only the people and that have like made this happen, but the vision of like healthcare for everyone that kind of founded it, and the ambition that made that happen. So we're working with Keep Our NHS Public to do local actions, and also doing cake baking with your NHS birthday wishes to tweet at your MP. So please do get involved in that. And after that, I think we'll be planning for some kind of big mobilisation moment in the autumn, which I hope people can join in with. Yeah, and I will leave it there.
Thanks, Danny. Fantastic. As you've heard from our panelists, this webinar is designed to be about the problems, but mostly solutions, and things we can do as activists, as operators in many different circles, what we can do to make a difference to the future. And I'm just going to move on. I'm going to encourage more questions. We've got quite a few building up, but there are a number of themes which are emanating from those questions. So I'm going to ask if start that in a minute. I'm going to just ask for our host to put up some more links, particularly to future events of Global Justice Now. which people can get or participate in the future from now. But one of the key themes that have come out of the questions has been about trade unions. There's a couple of questions directly to Alice, asking about which trade unions are you engaged with, and especially on the debate about electric vehicles and what have you. But Ash from Lincolnshire is asking about passenger aircraft and cruise liners are elbowing their way to the front of the queue for state handouts during the corona crisis. How can we argue against this without being anti-jobs, anti-leisure, anti-fun, and anti-normal? I think it's a very, very relevant question. There's often this dichotomy presented about, you're either for jobs or for the climate, and there's never the twain shall meet. I think there's been many examples where this has been proven not to be the case, but I'd like the panelists to take on this question about jobs and trade unions and their involvement in environmentalism, but also on, especially in the UK, we have, trade unions were supporting the construction of the third runway at Heathrow, which was an environmental catastrophe waiting to happen. Hopefully, it won't happen now. The demand for air travel has fallen somewhat, and what's happening in other places in Nigeria and in France about the air industry and the support for industries from trade unionists, which appears in some ways to be against the interests of environmentalists. Should we start with Alice with this one, because there's a couple of the questions that come to you. I'm not sure if you've read the questions, Alice, but if you could address the trade union issue, which you did in your lead-off, but we could have a bit more detail, that would be great.
So there are two main unions in our coalition. There's Solidaire, which is a founding member of ATTAC. So this is how we work with them. There is a representative in our board, so that I think that answers the question. But there's also La CGT. So CGT is the oldest union in France, and it's been linked to the Communist Party for a long time. So that tells you, a bit about their ideology. So it's with them that is the most complicated to work with. But they're evolving, and the problem is that it's a federation or a confederation. So when you can talk with some of the federations, you're not talking to every one of them. So that's a challenge for La CGT itself. So we are trying, as I said, to make sure that the dialogue is not stopped, and so we are saying yes. Some industries are going to be are detrimental to the climate. It will have to stop. But what we want most of all is also for rebuilding a real social protection. So we are really insisting also on workers' rights, their right to train, their right for benefits when they are unemployed, and so. But most of all, we don't want to say that it's going to be okay if we just say, okay, we're going to stop the car industry, and there is going to be another industry instead, because we don't believe that we can go back to old solutions when the state, was planning the whole economy. So we really want communities and workers themselves to think about, okay, so what should they produce? And the corona crisis has shown that some factories were actually able and willing to shift their old production to produce masks and other medical equipment. So I think this is how we can get trade unions on board, to say that we believe that workers themselves are aware of the ecological challenge, and if we let them decide, they can actually take it into their own hands and manage themselves, factories and the whole economy. So I look forward to hearing what the other speakers think about that.
Thanks, Alice. We'll ask now Danny to perhaps go into a bit more detail and perhaps some of the arguments we're having with trade unions or trade unionists in the UK about how we're getting on board and how we're actually putting the interests of our future generations above the immediate interests of some workers in some people's views.
Yeah, I think the trade union question, I feel like there shouldn't be, we need to be working really closely with the trade unions, I think. And I think there's a real like trust problem, particularly between like the environmental movement and like the like, you know, workers' rights movement, because, you know, it seems that the environmental movement is willing to throw workers under a bus, and like we absolutely cannot be seen to be doing that. And I think, so there's a real kind of like trust building exercise to happen. And I think where we've worked really constructively with unions is that, you know, we can keep debating, you know, how we've worked constructively with Unite, for example, is who've like a very like, you know, pro third runway, but it's like, let's focus on the things that we do agree on and we strategically align on. And that's how we create really like powerful collaborations that push the dial on like what is possible and like what the kind of populace wants, and kind of how we get there. So I think our approach to like working with unions has definitely been to like, let's focus on the positive, let's push really hard on the things that we know that we want and we can win on, and create a really kind of solid movement around that. And then we'll be in a position to have the harder conversations. And I think we haven't put the, you know, the green movement needs to line up. You know, change is really scary for people, and like lots of people have been through these transitions. Like transitions normally mean bad things, and like we need to really, you know, recognize that in people. And there's a very, you know, change, people want change, but change being done to you is disempowering and not fun and like scary. So how do we make sure that we're working with like in proper dialogues with those workers around like, okay, recognizing that, you know, this industry can't keep going, what do you want? And then saying, okay, we'll line up behind you, and we will fight to make sure that there's a jobs guarantee, that you're not like, your skills, you're given work that with equivalent, you know, kind of technical and like pay requirements, like unlike with the kind of miners, you know, kind of the transition out of coal in the 80s. So I think it's about like identifying this, like being there for recognizing that people are worried, being there for that fight, the environmental movement standing with people who are going through that. And yeah, I think there was a really great example. The NGO Possible last week worked with a group of pilots talking about current pilots and ex-pilots talking about why they wanted the aviation industry to change. And you know, those conversations were long and hard, but we can get somewhere if we do it.
Thanks, Danny. Nnimmo, is it a similar situation in Nigeria, or what's your experience, and what's the tell us about your successes about working with trade unions?
It's a mixed situation here. The biggest labor union in Nigeria is the Nigerian Labour Congress, and they are very concerned about climate change. They actually have a climate change strategy, and we do cooperate with them to prepare positions. They're very, in that sense, they're very green, I would say. they're pro climate action. But then you have the unions who are workers in the extractive sector, in the petroleum field, who are totally, they're more, they play the game of the industry. And I believe what they think is that if you speak of just transition, it means they're going to lose jobs, or everything will go somewhere else, without the deep understanding that really, of course, we know that if the industry wants to change or is forced to change, they would have to adapt, and then workers would have to learn new skills. But that is really not on the table from my conversations with unionists in that sector. If it's as bad, I think it's very big influence of management on workers, and so you don't see much movement in that direction.
Thank you, Nnimmo. We're going to move on now to a different theme. There's been a number of questions about world leaders and people who are in charge, and other people. Someone else has said they've got. I think Kathy has got trying to set up an interview with a Tory MP about, and what do I need to tell him? And we are suffering, especially if you look at the US, the UK, and Brazil. We're suffering quite an awful leadership in the world at the moment. How can we affect change when we've got such leaders? Is there any chance? Can we do things around them or despite them? And is there any hope? I also want to link in. There was one early question I can't quite scroll to at the moment, but saying, how urgent is this? Obviously, it's very urgent, but some reports say there's 6 months before we reach tipping point and what have you. So, what sense of urgency, and how do we work around this block we have above us in parliaments, in the White House, in governments around the world? Could I start, please, with Danny on this one?
So the question is how we get around governments that don't want to do what we want them to do. I mean, yeah, my answer to this is always so basic, but it's just like organize campaign. I think, Extinction Rebellion here have done such a good job of just like pushing the envelope and just really like kind of raising public consciousness and the imagination and really putting down radical demands and like really popularizing them. And I think, they really taught us a thing or two about, being bold and being very public and visible. And I think there's two sides to it. I think you need that like very public, very visible, very, very radical. And then we need the side that's about like community organizing and like bringing people with us and like them embodying the change that they want and being, because the changes that we're demanding are big and will affect all of us. And so engaging communities in how they want that change to happen and making sure that everyone is bought in with those changes and see that it's a good thing, I think is really important. Otherwise we risk having culture wars. And so I think it's about visible and bold, but it's also about building intentionally really broad-based support, and because it is in everyone's interests to tackle the climate emergency. So I think those two strands need to work in parallel, and I think we've done really well on the first, and we need to do better on the second.
Thanks, Danny. Nnimmo, would you chime in on this one? And perhaps give us a quick outline of the situation now with your government and climate action in Nigeria.
Well, that's a very complex question for me, and but let me in Nigeria, when you're faced with a difficult question, we say you can go to Afghanistan. That means you don't talk about Nigeria, you talk about anywhere else. So I'd like to talk about Britain and the US and Brazil at this time. Look, when we sit down here and look at the leadership in the global north, many of the countries, is really very astonishing, because we just wonder, how could this sort of people get to that level of leadership, be calling the shot and just taking the world in the wrong direction? The response to the coronavirus is a very clear example, where some leaders don't just care how many people die, provided they can hide the fact that people are dying. That's what the leaders are trying to do, to hide the fact that people are dying, that workers are dying, that citizens are dying. Just don't tell anybody. It doesn't matter. So this is the same response to global warming. We don't have, some of the leaders don't have many years to live. They're almost at the end of their time. And so they don't really care what happens to the children, what happens to the youths. So I believe that the response to the failure of leadership that we're seeing around us is about how patient would young people be. This is where the solution is going to come from. It will come from the young people, not from old folks like me. It's going to come from young people because they got the whole future ahead of them if they can change the system. But if they don't change the system, there's no future. And I think it's a terrible thing for anybody to live without having a dream of the future. So I think the vitality of the youth and we're seeing, for example, this, again, going back to the coronavirus, there's a lockdown, but it doesn't stop people from protesting. That is very symbolic, that the resilience of the collective is where the change will come from. Let this kind of resolve also go to the ballot box. When it's time to vote, don't just protest, go vote. It's got to be the ballot box. Otherwise, it will be something else, a revolution. The ballot box can also be a tool for revolution. But we really need to get angry enough, especially young people, angry enough to say, look, we have a future. I was going to say we have a dream. Of course, I could say that too. We have a future that we want to get to. And that to me is where and this is somebody asked the question, they can give us something to hope on. And I think the people on the street, in the face of the virus, protesting racism, protesting colonialism, saying Black Lives Matter, every life matter, that to me is the hope that we have, that no matter how difficult things are, no matter how dangerous it is, people are ready to come together, solidarity, people are coming together. This is where the future is.
Thank you, Nnimmo. Alice, just as I was asking that question, I couldn't quite scroll down, and then I see that Barbara from the South Coast has framed it much more eloquently than I did. How do we frame the story in debate with politicians to get action on climate within the next 5 years when we have right-wing governments like our own with large majorities? Is this an impossible circle to square, or have we got a chance? What do you say to that, Alice?
Well, I think we can't have a discussion with the head of state we have at the moment. I mean, so I'm just, well, starting with it's not the Black Lives Matter in France. It's a very similar movement, but in France, it's organized around several comités justice et vérité, so committees for justice and truth. And they've been organizing for several years. And I think that we have a lot to learn from them, because it's actually the first time since lockdown that we have protests that are significant. So I'd say that we have to learn from the Black Lives Matter movements and also the feminist movements, which are the most successful movements. Even though, now that I've said that, they're radical. They are interesting in the sense that they include. I mean, I can be critical about ATTAC. I think the feminist movement and the Black Lives Matter movement are much more diverse in terms of social makeup than ATTAC. So I think that we have to learn from them, because we're really white, very. We've all been to university, almost. So I think that we have to learn from these movements in order to put pressure on the government, because I don't think that we can discuss anything with this government. And if we look at the past, the successful movements, they've never been negotiating with governments. The last thing that we've achieved was the cancellation of the Notre-Dame-des-Landes airport. So it was 2 or 3 years ago, and it came after years of struggle on the ground. So people were in the field, they were occupying the place, and several times a year, tens of thousands of people would travel to Notre-Dame-des-Landes and saying they were opposed to the project. But it took a change in government. So I think it's good to put pressure on the government and waiting until the next election, where politicians have to, take a side and that's when you can be successful. But there's a great democracy crisis at the moment, because the current government in France was elected by 40% of voters. So they don't really care what we're saying, because they don't represent the majority already. So I think, no, there's no discussion to be had. We have to put pressure, and for that we have to learn from other more radical and more inclusive movements.
Thank you, Alice. There's a question that was asked earlier on the Q&A, which I want to have a look at now. It comes from Biddy Garstang in Somerset. Hello, Biddy. It's so good to see you here. It comes in two parts. It's I'll read the question now. It says, it's now the time for high change to make the public more aware that we must all pay more, as well as trying to make ecocide a crime as soon as possible. What are I take that in two parts. What are the sacrifices you see ordinary, everyday people having to make to achieve the change that we need for environmental restoration and a future? And what crimes need to be introduced to such statute book, if any? Do we need to see more international laws, perhaps to take on corporations, to take on governments who might be passing regressive policies on the ecology? So how does it affect individuals, and what we must sacrifice? There's been talk earlier about changes in our usage of transport and our mobility and what have you, but also there's other aspects of that for individuals. And secondly, the laws we have to enact and to actually use to keep the governments and corporations in check. Could we start with Nnimmo on that one?
Thank you, and I will answer only a part of your long question. I'll answer the part that talks about what laws do we need, and that I believe that it's a time for ecocide to be recognized as a crime at the same level as crimes against humanity and unusual crimes, war crimes, genocide, and the rest. But really, if you look at ecocide talks about destruction of environment to an irreversible level, or more or less close to that. And this is something that affects not just biodiversity, but affects humans. People who are living very close, everybody needs to live. We all live in the environment. Even if we go to space, there will be environment in space. The people living in the crime scenes called oil fields and mine fields are paying extremely high price for the luxuries that people are enjoying around the world. I go to the Niger Delta frequently, and you can just go to a community and you look at the entire river ahead of you is covered with crude oil. And recently, government told us we have 5 oil spills every day. 5 oil spills every day. You don't hear about this in the news. You don't read about it in Europe. But it's oil companies from Europe or from North America who are messing up everywhere down here. And the shareholders don't have a clue, or pretend not to have a clue about the crimes that the corporations are committing on a daily basis. People are losing their lives. We talk about a situation where oil companies are burning gas because they say there are cheaper ways, there are cheaper oil fields to get gas in a cheaper way, but they choose to burn gas that is connected with crude oil extraction. And so by this, they've reduced life expectancy to the Niger Delta to 41 years. Can you imagine that? Can you just think about that? And and somebody believes that nothing is wrong. Of course, and this has gone on for a long time. I mean, you could the corporations, the Nigerian government are all complicit because they're working together in tandem. You find in many parts of other regions in the world, the corporations and the politicians are working closely together, so they cannot be separated in terms of responsibility. Although the corporations are the operators and they should be higher. And we believe that if ecocide is recognized as a law, as a crime, that would hold corporations accountable and hold the directors of these corporations personally liable. If that happens, corporations will behave more responsibly. Right now, they can hide behind the corporate shields, commit crimes against people, against humanity, against the environment, and they just go home enjoying their profits. The profit is blood money, pure and simple.
Thank you, Nnimmo. Alice, what's your view on those two questions on individual sacrifice or changes we might have to make, and secondly on laws we need introduced to tackle this crisis?
Well, of course, we need laws, and ATTAC has been a member of the Stop Corporate Impunity campaign that was demanding a binding international treaty. But the problem is that the discussions were on at the UN level, but I think the European Union as well as the US have made everything possible to stop the process and make sure that it doesn't there's no treaty, especially not a binding one. But I think I wouldn't focus too much on individual sacrifices, because some individuals don't have anything to sacrifice already. That would be unfair to ask some people who struggle to make ends meet to sacrifice. But of course, I mean, we have to address the issue of, as Western countries, our way of life depends on the extraction of resources from the global South countries, and that needs to stop. That needs to be on the table. That needs to be in the discussion. But what would be the point of using less water, buying as much local food as you can, cycling to work, if the banks still invest in fossil fuels, if the government doesn't address the tax loopholes that allow companies and individuals to still invest in fossil fuels? So I think it's good for people who can to make efforts, but I think the discussion should be placed at another level, so that's the level of corporations and governments. So that will be my answer.
Thank you, Alice. Danny, I'm sure there's things that haven't been addressed in those two fantastic answers. If you'd like to carry it on.
Yeah, I won't speak about laws. I think that's been like, I'd ban advertising. That's got to go, as a specific one. And I think which links to I think just rejecting the premise of sacrifice, because I think as soon as we're talking about sacrifice, we're very specific about, I think it's only a sacrifice if you live in a capitalist mindset of what is important. And I think the great thing, great is actually the wrong word, I will never use that word again, but the interesting thing that's happening now in this pandemic is people really reevaluating their values and what is important and what's important to them. And it's not the things that are sold to you by multi-million corporations on the TV all the time. It is not the things that global capitalism is telling us that we want. So I think it's not about, we don't pitch our movement as sacrifice. We're reconnecting with the things that actually matter. And I think that's the way that we've got to go about this. And we're positive and visionary and talking about the things that we want, that are community and family and connection and nature. And I think as soon as and obviously that's very easy to say, right? But I think we do need to, as soon as we recognize that it's like our adversary is capitalism and being sold things, it becomes easier to like frame it not as a sacrifice, but as fundamentally actually changing the system and changing our mindset, and that's really important. And I think the other thing about like sacrifice, saying the word sacrifice, which like people in the chat have said, is like, that's really speaking to who you think your movement is. And like, you know, if you're sacrificing stuff, it means you're like global north middle class. It's not, you're not building the movement, like the people at the bottom aren't sacrificing anything. The global south is not, you know what I mean? So I think like we need to get away from this idea of sacrifice because it speaks to a certain demographic and it's not visionary enough.
Thank you so much. That's put a fantastic answer to that. I'm going to now, it has been alluded to, and I think what Danny's just said does actually start to answer this. But there's one theme about, especially the corona crisis side of this whole thing, is what hope has come. Has hope increased? I think Danny was addressing this just now, but has hope increased over the past few months? Is there more opportunity now? There's certainly been plenty written about how, you know, the reduction in air flights and the rest of it, and how things have improved. But this seems to be quite a superficial change for the environment, and probably quite short-lived in this medium term. But what hope has increased over this coronavirus crisis, and has that left you as a panelist here more optimistic or less? Alice?
Well, I have to say I'm less optimistic than before, because as most people at the beginning of lockdown, I could see that we were willing and ready to make a lot of efforts to tackle the health crisis. And I thought, well, maybe then after the lockdown we could be making the same kind of efforts to tackle the climate crisis or the ecological crisis. Then as weeks went by, I realized that it was all going to go back to normal after the lockdown, and the government is already talking about working more rather than sharing work, so that the corporations are already lobbying for trade deals and less rights for workers. So not really optimistic. On the other hand, I know that it's been a generational experience, and in the long term, I think it's going to have effects in one way or another. That the youngest generation will want another world, but in the very short term, I think it's going to be very, very complicated. We've won a recent fight because the government used the lockdown to forbid or prohibit protests. They said no, you can't be there can't be more than 10 people in the streets. So no protests, no demonstrations, and it went to the state council, and they ruled that actually this prohibition was unconstitutional. So we're going to have the right to protest. So that makes me optimistic. But on the other hand, I can see this is because we have been mobilizing already. And in French, it's very interesting because you can have a play on words. If you say we don't want to get back to normal, it can sound as we don't want to get back to what was abnormal. So it's been a great campaign as well to say that the day after that we wanted shouldn't be, you know, the same kind of world that we had before. But it's gonna take a lot of efforts, I think.
Thank you, Alice. Nnimmo.
Yeah. Well, I don't really have something to add to this. I think it's been articulated, and
but
yeah.
are you feeling more optimistic or not as a result of this recent crisis?
Yeah, that has always been a difficult question, but what drives optimism is hope that we can make change happen. When we believe we cannot make change happen, then there's no optimism. Optimism is not that somebody's going to change anything, but we have to make that change happen. And I believe we have the capacity to make that change happen.
Okay, Danny, have you got more to add?
Yeah, on hope. I want to come just quickly back on Kath's point about sacrifice, and I'm not saying it's not changed. Like, those people's lives will be impacted, but I think it's the movement's responsibility to not make that a sacrifice. Like, if this movement is successful, like, oil industry workers will be fully supported to kind of transition, and it won't mean a sacrifice. So I think that's what I meant, rather than like pretending that it's not going to impact people. Am I more hopeful? Yes, I am, because the conditions ultimately, in many ways, our opposition haven't changed. The government is still not on board. The private companies are still lobbying as hard as they can to get their way. That's always been the case. That's always been our opposition. I think the difference now that does make me hopeful is that, the countervailing force to that is people's will and people's ability to organize against it. And I actually think there has been in people a slight reevaluation in people's minds about like what is important and what is possible, particularly from a government like intervention level. And I think that like psychological shift is what is needed as the force to fight against all the things that were already bad and are going to continue to be bad unless we fight them. So I think that mind shift is the most important thing that gives me hope, and that's why I have hope. I think what's a real challenge for our movement is that like that's premised on people then like turning that into organizing and power. And while we can't kind of meet in person, which is such a huge part of having hope and being inspired, I think that for me is the challenge, rather than corporate power, because that was always our enemy. And now like social distancing is our kind of new enemy in a way, to like delivering on that hope and that like change mindset. So yeah, but I am more hopeful. And people in Bristol are tearing down statues and throwing them in the river. That's wicked. That gives me hope.
Thanks, Danny. We're coming towards the end. I think we've got time for one last question. John Kutra asked a bit earlier about the Capitol Hill Autonomous Zone in Seattle. Is this a good example of how we can use direct action to affect action on a local level? I ask this really because there's different forms of, and different framing. And again, Danny's just hit it on the head by talking about Bristol and statues. The actions we take can be framed by media in different ways, and certainly attacked by the media in different ways, and those in power. Could panelists give us one example of an action, not necessarily about climate, but an action which has certainly had an impact, and something they would like to see imported into the struggle for climate justice? I really want to just quickly ask that of the panelists, but also ask a question of the participants here. I hope you've benefited and enjoyed the discussion tonight. I certainly have, and I think it's very much a question about not just having a talking shop and not just having these great ideas bandied around, but making sure that we use those ideas to make a real difference. And I'd really implore you to think about joining Global Justice Now. if you go to our website, and I'm sure that we'll get a link up on both the chat on the chat in a minute about the how to join Global Justice Now. It doesn't cost a huge amount of money, but it makes a huge amount of difference, and we really do need to make our networks and our organisation stronger. If you could do that, we'd really welcome you on board. We have a number of different groups around the country who are active, who are discussing these ideas, and who are certainly active in different organisations as well as just Global Justice Now. We don't pretend we're the answer to all your ills, but we are part of that answer. So do consider joining, and we'll just finish off now with asking our panelists about actions that have inspired them, actions which have made a difference, and things that they would like to see our movement actually do in the coming months. We'll start this one with Nnimmo.
Yeah, thank you. And what I've learned really during this pandemic has been that activists can get a lot more invisible than we are at the moment. Getting things done without necessarily being visible. That means getting the grassroots to really be the grassroots. And what is giving me, what I'm really getting encouraged about is that we can do things without going to certain places physically. And I'm seeing social groups that are usually ignored by the state and by corporations, really speaking up right now because they have to take their destiny in their hands. And they now have opportunity of doing that because you don't have people becoming the megaphones on their behalf. So we have to, the hope I have is that we're going to see more organic, horizontal development of the movements and then coming together also organically without having the kind of hierarchical NGO type of arrangements. This is making me believe that, yes, we can really build a force that will change the system when the system thought it was stronger. Because rigid systems are not really solid systems. And so the system is quite rigid and it can easily be broken. And this to break the system means to hit it at the roots, and the grassroots is the best place from where action really happen that will change things.
Thanks, Nnimmo. Danny, could you give us your example?
My example is from France, actually, and it's an action I saw by the Gilets Noirs, who are the kind of undocumented migrant workers who, and I think the first action that they did, they've since done these amazing actions like occupying the Pantheon and some incredible stuff. But this first one was, this big hotel which is using kind of undocumented workers, treating them terribly, and they all, and it was kind of well documented, and they even had like a PR person dealing with it, and it was disgusting. And 200 undocumented migrants went and sat in the lobby of that hotel. They're all undocumented. These are literally the most precarious people in that situation. They don't have papers. And they went and occupied the hotel lobby on behalf of the workers that work there and got into like negotiation with the management and got those workers recognized. And that was just, for me, that was super powerful because it's direct action. It's like people really putting themselves on the line for others and just showing that they're really powerful and they're not scared. And I think, yeah, it's the Gilets Noirs, and I think they're really inspiring.
Thanks, Danny. Alice, what really comes to mind in your experience over actions that inspire?
It's really hard to pick, but there was there's a group within ATTAC France that I'm quite fond of. I'm gonna just share a link. It's all in French. I'm sorry, but there are videos because it's a group of women. They've started creating choreographies to be performed during demonstrations, and it's been quite successful, and it's really participated in the success of the protest against the pension reform. And I've been participating myself, and I think this is what I like in activism. It's that you do things together, you enjoy yourself, and you dance, you do things, and yeah, I think it's quite inspirational, even though that's ATTAC, so I don't know whether it counts, but and it's allowed us to be, it made women want to join us, and that in itself was a big step. So so the group is named the Rosie, so roses. You can tell from how they dress, and they've created choreographies to support carers and health workers who are in the vast majority women. So yeah, that's the action I want to talk about.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Alice. I'm going to now put out a plug. We have a new resource produced by Global Justice Now. It's a pamphlet. It's designed as a graphic novel. We did one a while ago on the refugee crisis, and there's a new pamphlet out which is about climate justice. It's a good explanation of it. It's a great explainer to especially young people about what climate justice is and how we're trying to fight for it, and a real politicization of the question in a radical and progressive way. I was just looking for the link for it. I couldn't find the email which came in with it, but try checking our website for the climate justice pamphlet and download a copy. We will be sending them out when we've got our heads around how to go about that very soon. So if you want copies sent to you, do get in touch. There'll be a way of ordering them on our website soon. I just want to finish up now by thanking our panel. I think it's been a really instructive discussion. I think pulling in one thing we've noticed about this move really to online meetings is how fantastic it is to get an international panel together without paying airfares and without destroying the environment to try and get people together. And it's been an incredible organising experience for us, and something we're going to continue going in way after lockdown, I'm sure. So the next event coming up is on Saturday, the 27th of June. It's the Activist Assembly on the US-UK trade deal. Please check out our website and come along to that. We've got the pamphlet out, as I've just mentioned, and there'll be more events happening in the future. Please stay in touch. Please join us if you can. And I'd like to thank each one of our panelists, Nnimmo Bassey, Alice Picard, and Danny Paffard, for their fantastic contributions tonight. And we'll sign off now and hopefully see you all again very soon. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.